Today, we're tackling a piece of source material that is, let's just say it's as philosophically relentless as it is historically detailed.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a really deep intellectual challenge, I think this is definitely it.
It is. We are plunging headfirst into a work that mounts this incredibly sustained structural critique of the great monotheisms.
Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
All three.
All three. And it argues that their foundational texts and, the entire way of thinking that comes from them are rooted in a fundamental hostility, a hostility toward life, toward intelligence, and maybe most of all, toward the body.
And that is the central, and I mean truly explosive thesis we need to unpack today.
Yeah.
The source claims that the concept of God wasn't just some benign spiritual creation.
No, not at all.
It was invented as what's the term it uses? A counter-concept to life.
A counter-concept, exactly. A synthesis of everything poisonous, harmful, and slanderous toward genuine earthly reality. So you can see this isn't your standard atheism. Not by a long shot. This is a systematic deconstruction of the entire architecture of transcendence.
Precisely. The core argument is that the invention of a beyond, or a true world, heaven, paradise, whatever you want to call it, served one single purpose.
Which was?
To devalue and invalidate the only world we actually have, the one we inhabit right now. All that hostility to our life gets synthesized into this this gruesome unity.
So our mission for this deep dive is to provide a kind of intellectual roadmap through this really dense analysis. We're going to trace the history, philosophical atheism, and really try to grasp the structure of this argument.
An argument which, by the way, aims to lay the foundation for a whole new counter-discipline. The author calls it atheology.
Atheology. We will definitely get into that. But before we jump into the intellectual family tree of this critique, let's start with a really grounding image from the source's preface. It's a kind of surprising origin story for this whole belief system.
It really is. It sets the stage for why an afterlife was even necessary in the first place.
And it all comes down to geography.
The author suggests that monotheism was, and this is a direct quote, born of the sand.
Born of the sand. That's a very stark phrase. How does it connect geography to theology?
Well, it draws a direct line from the intense, punishing geography of the desert. We're talking regions like Mauritania, Israel, Judea, where the sun just bakes people's heads, it desiccates their bodies, and it afflicts their souls with this unquenchable thirst.
So it's about the physical suffering.
It's about the sheer physical exhaustion and the terror of the void created by just ceaseless wandering across these unending vistas of orange sand. That experience, that suffering, led directly to the invention of the afterlife as a form of cosmic relief.
So the promise of paradise, this yearning for a cool, clear oasis for balmy air, abundant food and drink that gets institutionalized, it becomes the promise of heaven.
Yes.
Transcendence, then, is really just compensation for this crushing, unavoidable physical reality here on Earth.
That's the argument. And in this compensatory system, the body has to be despised. The invention of the soul, or the spirit, especially the immortal soul, was designed specifically to despise the body, to make it sick, or holy, as the source puts it.
And to oppose everything that's actually important in life.
With a kind of ghastly levity, yeah. Everything that deserves to be taken seriously, nourishment, cleanliness, intellectual rigor, is pushed aside.
It sounds like a psychological diagnosis, really, where the resulting religion is a kind of mass neurosis, and it replaces earthly health with the promise of spiritual salvation.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it's the perfect metaphor for explaining the philosophical assault that the source then launches.
Okay, let's unpack that. The intellectual roots of this doubt.
The source starts with this core tension. The idea that most people prefer, comforting fairy tales from childhood over the cruel hard facts of adults.
Which results in what it calls a perpetual mental infantilism.
That's the diagnosis of the problem, yes. The belief in an afterlife, or immortality, it abolishes the profound tragedy of death, which is comforting.
But the price is monstrous.
A monstrous price. A fundamental disregard for the real world, the only world there is. The comfort is bought by willfully neglecting immanence. And that, the source claims, is a state of spiritual poverty that leads to self-renunciation.
Okay, so if that's the pathology, what's the cure? The source is pretty clear that it can't be fought with more magic or, chaotic counter-beliefs.
No, it requires rigorous philosophical work, and this is key. Atheism, in this context, isn't presented as just a simple denial or even as a form of therapy.
It's presented as A restoration of mental health?
A restoration of mental health through the sound use of understanding and reason. It means mobilizing your intelligence, your critical will, to dispel these phantoms that we've imposed on ourselves.
But what's interesting is that the source doesn't just start attacking religion. It first analyzes the history of the Enlightenment itself.
And it finds a profound intellectual timidity there, even among these revered figures like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau.
They were deists, weren't they? They rejected the dogmatism of the church and, the whole idea of divine intervention.
Absolutely. But they strenuously rejected outright atheism and materialism. They were bold for their time, but they stopped short. They didn't pull the trigger on the concept of God entirely.
And no one exemplifies this compromise better than Kant.
Kant is central to this argument. The source focuses heavily on his critique of pure reason. 600 pages that had, and I'm quoting, the unparalleled explosive potential to blow Western metaphysics sky high.
So why was it so explosive? What was Kant actually about to kill with this book?
Well, he rigorously, and I mean rigorously, demonstrated that human knowledge is limited to the phenomenal world.
The world of appearances, the stuff we can perceive and measure.
Exactly. And he systematically undermined every single traditional philosophical proof for the existence of God, the soul, and free will. He showed that when reason tries to go beyond experience to talk about this metaphysical or noumenal world,
the world beyond our senses.
right, it inevitably falls into self-contradiction. He basically proved that God could not be known by reason. It was a philosophical kill shot.
But he stopped. He pulled his punch. He proved reason couldn't affirm God, yet somehow he found a way to save him.
He did. The source jokes that Kant's mother, who was an austere pietist, must have been holding his hand. He separated faith and reason.
Which on the surface sounds, reasonable.
It seems rational, but by declaring faith a totally separate sphere, the domain of practical reason or morality, he basically let religion go scot-free. He forced reason to abdicate its authority in the most important domain of all.
And in doing so, he made room for and even postulated the pillars of religion.
God, the immortal soul, and free will. He saved them.
So his big compromise ended up preserving the basis for punitive morality. And this is where the source pushes back, right? It encourages us to be Kantian in opposition to Kant.
Yes, if Kant taught us the courage to use our own intelligence, then we have to apply that courage everywhere, without exception. The final push is to postulate the non-existence of God, the death of the soul, and the non-existence of free will.
It's about carrying the Enlightenment to its final logical conclusion.
A necessary conclusion.
Oh, yeah.
And that necessity is what demands the creation of this new field, atheology.
Okay, let's talk about that term. How is atheology different from just being an atheist? It sounds more scientific, maybe? Or is it just a philosophical stance?
It's both. But at its core, it's a systematic critical discipline. The author actually borrows the term from Georges Bataille, who proposed a work called Summa Theologica.
A counter to the Summa Theologica.
Precisely. Simple atheism is a negation. It's just, I don't believe in God. But atheology is meant to be a countercurrent to theology. It flows upstream, so to speak, to examine the mechanisms of theology up close, to expose the backside of the theological scenery.
So it's not enough to just deny God. You have to understand the mental machinery that created the concept in the first place and what keeps it going.
Exactly. And this requires a massive mobilization of different fields, which the source details pretty carefully. It starts with psychology and psychoanalysis to look at the fable-generating function. Why do we need these stories?
And
Then you need metaphysics to plot the genealogy of transcendence. You need archaeology and paleography for the actual texts, and of course, critical philosophy and history. You have to scrutinize how these beliefs propagate across time and space.
So treating religion as a social and historical phenomenon, not as something that's totally outside the reach of scientific critique.
That's the mission of atheology.
And this need for a new discipline, it also seems to stem from the failure of what is probably the most famous philosophical announcement ever made, Nietzsche's God is dead.
Right. That was supposed to usher in a whole new era.
But the source calls it a false announcement. Why?
Because, as it says, no corpse was produced. It was a premature announcement, an ontological gimmick. God exists only insofar as he is needed to make daily life bearable as we head toward extinction.
So you can't kill an idea just by declaring it dead.
You can't kill a dream, a breeze, or an illusion. The source says, chillingly, that the illusion is more likely to kill us by killing reason and the critical mind.
So if the illusion is immortal because it's tied to our biological fear of death, isn't this entire project of atheology kind of doomed? Why bother if the root cause, the horror of the void, is just part of our wiring?
Because the critique has to shift. It's not about just announcing God's demise anymore. It's about systematically dismantling the mental architecture and, crucially, the social structure that profits from and reinforces that illusion. The insight is that the last God will expire with the last man. So the task isn't to kill God, but to create a culture that no longer needs him.
A culture based on a completely new ethic, transvaluation.
That's the goal. A formidable task, as the source says, still to be brought to fruition.
Okay, that sets the stage beautifully. We've established the philosophical failure of the Enlightenment to finish the job. Now let's look at the actual consequences of that failure on human life, starting with what the source calls the shared structural hatreds of monotheism.
This is really the structural core of the entire critique. The idea that all three monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, share these fundamental structural hatreds.
And this is despite their often violent mutual hostilities toward each other.
Exactly. Beneath the surface conflicts, they're built on the same foundation.
So what are these shared fixations that the source claims stem from this death instinct?
It's a whole list of aversions. A systemic aversion to reason and intelligence, a hatred of freedom, a hatred of all books in the name of one book alone, and of course a hatred of sexuality, of women, and of pleasure itself.
And on the flip side, they all extol the countervalues.
They do. Faith, obedience, submission, a taste for death, the asexual angel, chastity, the spirit over the body.
It's a pretty comprehensive rejection of what you called immanence earlier. For someone listening, what does rejecting immanence actually mean in daily life? Is it just about, not having fun, or is it deeper?
Oh, it's much, much deeper. To reject immanence is to reject the idea that meaning, value, and goodness can be found within this world, within our physical experience, within nature.
So the claim from monotheism is that everything real, the sensual, the temporary, the physical, is somehow flawed.
It's flawed, it's dirty, or it's a temptation. And that true goodness, true value, resides only in the transcendent beyond. So daily life becomes a struggle against reality itself.
And the source argues this rejection is codified right at the very beginning, in the foundational myth of Adam and Eve, the ban on intelligence.
Absolutely. You find the same basic fable in the Torah, the Old Testament, and the Quran. God orders the primal couple not to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge.
And the key point here is that the transgression wasn't sexual, as a lot of later church fathers would claim.
No, it was intellectual. It was about acquiring wisdom, about distinguishing between good and evil, and in doing so, aspiring to resemble God, who is the source of that wisdom.
So defying God's command meant choosing philosophy, choosing knowledge and autonomy over blind obedience.
That's the choice, and the consequence is severe. God's intended fate for humanity, according to this reading, is defined as stupidity and mortality.
And the source actually characterizes Eve as making the correct philosophical choice.
It does. She opts for intelligence, even at the risk of death. Adam, on the other hand, chose obedience. And once they acquired knowledge, they saw reality for what it is. Tragic.
They saw their nudity, they understood hardship, the battle between the sexes, toil, and ultimately death. Knowledge brings tragedy,
while obedience brings blissful ignorance.
So the question the source poses is really stark then. Is it better to live with a consoling story that forces us to waste the only thing we actually possess, life here and now, or to embrace a difficult truth that removes all hope of immortality but saves us from, living only half alive?
Yeah, and that's why the original sin is the sin of intelligence. The foundation of the whole system is built on punishing that choice.
And to maintain that structure of obedience, the source says monotheisms then rely on this pervasive tyranny of taboos and this obsession with purity.
Exactly. Since man is now separated from God after paradise, God reveals himself only through prohibitions and rules, a litany of them.
And the more prohibitions there are, the more licit and illicit things, the greater the chance of messing up.
And the deeper the guilt. And the greater the submission to the clergy, who, of course, speak in God's name.
These prohibitions are often seemingly arbitrary, but that's the point, isn't it? They measure submission perfectly.
They're perfect litmus tests. Think about Jewish law, forbidding shellfish aquatic creatures that don't have fins or scales, or the old Catholic rule about not eating meat on Friday, or the Muslim ban on pork.
These aren't necessarily about health or logic.
No, they are tests of obedience to an invisible, detailed, all-seeing authority. If you adhere to these fussy, seemingly irrational rules, you demonstrate your complete and total submission.
And this extends from food to the body itself, the impurity of the body. This obsession with purity, it associates the body with dirt, with vile materials, with contamination.
Which is where the heterosexuality really comes in. The body is inherently dirty. It's composed of base fluids and secretions, urine, blood, feces. This obsession leads to all these specific ritual bans.
Like the ban on approaching a menstruating woman?
Right. And from the source's critical viewpoint, this ban has nothing to do with hygiene. It stems from a demographic and patriarchal anxiety. A woman who is infertile during her cycle or right after giving birth possesses a sexuality that is completely divorced from procreation.
And pure sexuality just for pleasure, divorced from the necessity of making more believers.
Is absolute evil in this context.
Right.
Exactly. The source notes that the condemnation of homosexuality, which you see in Leviticus, and the horror of abortion, they all stem from this same principle.
The family unit, which implies mandated procreation and demographic expansion, is the sacred fixed horizon.
And the individual's free desire is totally unacceptable.
So since the real physical body is such a source of trouble and sin, the ultimate solution is to invent the ultimate non-material domain.
Paradise, the anti-world.
It's the ultimate ideological creation designed specifically to make the real world tolerable.
Or ideally undesirable. The source argues that theologians had to borrow heavily from Greek philosophers, people like Pythagoras and Plato, to construct their city of the spirit, where these immaterial ideas could flourish, eternal and immune to corruption.
And the specific details about the Muslim paradise are fascinating in how perfectly they reverse the hardships of the desert experience.
The source calls it a hysterically conceived geography. It's incredible. Everything that is forbidden or lacking on earth is just hyperbolically available in heaven.
They're parched on earth.
In heaven, rivers flow with milk, honey, wine, and water. They're ascetic and poor on earth. In heaven, they wear silk and gold and enjoy beautiful, eternally virginal houris.
The irony is just. It's profound. Everything forbidden on earth becomes the ultimate reward in the afterlife.
And the celestial body itself is paradoxical. It shines forth in its own immateriality. There's no need for sleep, no illness, no sorrow, and crucially, no need to defecate or pass gas.
The source gets very specific about that.
It does. The revolting smells of earth become these musk-scented exhalations from languid bodies in paradise. The body is reborn, radiating light from the points where it touched the prayer mat on earth.
So who could possibly value the earthly, sinful, temporary body when this glorious, perfect, celestial one is guaranteed?
It's the ultimate sales pitch. This systematic killing of the life urge, establishing death on earth for the sake of eternity in heaven. The source has a great line for it. Fleeing life in order not to have to die pays death twice.
That brings us back to the stark human consequences of these narratives.
The source contrasts two extremes. On one hand, you have this gentle Mauritanian herdsman, Abdurrahman, who was terrified of being barred from paradise because he accidentally ran over a jackal.
And on the other,
the 9/11 terrorists who believed with absolute certainty that they had secured eternal bliss by annihilating thousands of innocent people. The same book, the Quran, inspired both.
Which just highlights how the promise of this anti-world, combined with the contradictory nature of the sacred texts, allows for selective readings that can justify literally any action.
From saintly submission over a dead animal to inhuman cruelty.
Okay, let's shift focus to the construction of Christianity specifically. The source undertakes a truly radical analysis here, starting with the figure of Jesus himself.
It does. The claim is that his historical existence is, at best, insufficient and inconclusive.
And that he functions more as a concept than a person.
Now that is a truly radical claim. Does the source acknowledge the vast amount of non-Christian historical evidence that points to some kind of historical figure, a wandering preacher from Galilee named Jesus? How does it reconcile that gap?
It does acknowledge the context. First-century Palestine was apparently rife with these messianic, ecstatic prophets. It mentions a figure named Theudas who claimed he could divide a river.
Okay.
So the source argues that the historical evidence, once you strip away all the theological overlay, suggests Jesus was probably just one of these figures. But the concept of Jesus, the Son of God, that crystallized the messianic aspirations needed by a subjugated population. He functions as a philosophical idea, not a proven historical personality.
And to create this conceptual demigod, the gospel authors, who never knew the actual man, engaged in what the source calls the catalysis of the miraculous.
Which means they basically recycled literary fashions, or topoi, from pagan antiquity. To make this simple man seem extraordinary, they had to embellish.
So what are some examples of that?
Well, his virgin birth is compared to stories about Plato's mother having an intact hymen. His miracles are paralleled with stories about Empedocles bringing a corpse to life. The authors despised history, is the argument, because the stories didn't need to be factually real.
They just needed to be performative.
Exactly, creating truth by the very act of articulating it.
And since Jesus, like Buddha and Socrates, never actually wrote down his own philosophy, the myth was easy to construct after the fact.
A tissue of contradictions that eventually had to be sorted out by political authority. Church councils, late in the 4th century, choosing which fictions to affirm and which apocryphal stories to throw out.
Like the stories of the infant Jesus redirecting streams.
Yeah, things that compromise the necessary, unequivocal narrative they were trying to build.
But the truly crucial moment in the source's critique of Christianity isn't Jesus. It's Paul of Tarsus.
The Pauline contamination.
Paul is characterized as the true driving force behind this global messianic cult, despite the fact that he never knew Jesus. His conversion on the road to Damascus
in 34 CE
is described as arising from pure hysterical pathology, the fall from his horse, the temporary blindness and deafness, a mythomaniac tendency to claim Jesus spoke directly to him.
That's an extraordinary leap. The source is arguing that the entire moral structure of one of the world's largest religions originated in the deep-seated neuroses and pathologies of one single man.
That is the assertion, that Paul's personal issues, the source suggests self-hatred, possibly sexual impotence, or some chronic physical illness, his famous thorn in the flesh, were transformed into a vigorous hatred of the world.
A weakling's revenge.
That's the phrase. Unable to lead a conventional life of desire, he declared all sexuality null and void, not just for himself, but for the entire world.
So celibacy wasn't a choice, it was a revenge against the body. And this personal neurosis then became institutionalized misogyny.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He affirmed, I pummel my body and I subdue it, urging all men to follow his masochistic example. And women, who represented desire in life, were consequently condemned.
They must obey men in silence.
And find their only salvation through motherhood. It's the embrace of that disastrous foundational idea that Eve was the source of all evil. This internal personal poison spread globally.
And this spiritual pathology was soon validated by external political power. We move from Paul's neurosis to the state power of Constantine's coup d'etat.
A huge turning point. This shift, starting in 312 CE, transformed Christianity from a scattered, often persecuted sect into a political instrument. Constantine, who the source portrays as a cunning strategist, saw the zeal of this growing minority and just annexed it.
His victory at the Milvi's Bridge, which followed an astrological sign that he interpreted as Christ's endorsement,
gave him the divine pretext he needed to unify the empire under a single banner.
He effectively balked the Christians.
Yes. He bought them with massive state support, tax exemptions, generous subsidies, and new laws that satisfied the ascetic ideal-hardening divorce laws, forbidding concubines, banning magic. He consolidated his own power by aligning the state with the spiritual demands of the Christians.
And Constantine himself was no moral beacon, despite declaring himself the 13th apostle at the Council of Nicaea.
Far from it. The source is unflinching on this. It mentions his extreme tyranny, including infanticide and the drowning of his wife Fausta in boiling water.
Yet he was baptized right before he died,
securing the church's absolute forgiveness and, more importantly, its silence for his crimes, all in exchange for state endorsement. This merger established the first totalitarian Christian state.
And his successors completed that shift from victims to victimizers. They began systematically dismantling the ancient world.
Theodosius I, Valentinian III, Justinian, they enacted laws that, point by point, correspond to modern definitions of totalitarianism. Using constraint, destroying symbolic sites, exterminating opponents. This wasn't just about religious difference anymore.
It was a political purge.
A full-on political purge. The horror of this period involved the destruction of priceless cultural history, like the Serapeum Library in Alexandria.
And the burning of philosophical books.
The destruction was deliberate and it was comprehensive. Justinian hammered in the final nail in 529 CE. He made it mandatory for pagans to take instruction in the Christian religion and undergo baptism on pain of exile and confiscation of all their property.
So ancient culture was systematically eradicated?
And replaced by a political ideology supported by the state's iron fist. And this is crucial for the argument. The political power came before the moral defense was fully articulated.
Okay, so the totalitarian state established by Justinian proves the power of the church. But the source asks, how do they justify this brutality? And that brings us to the core moral defense often offered by religion.
The idea that God's existence is necessary to prevent moral chaos.
Dostoevsky's famous refrain, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted.
And the author pivots on this sharply. The argument is the exact opposite. Because God exists, everything is permitted. 30 centuries of history, the source claims, show that the assertion of one jealous, bellicose, and intolerant God has generated far more hate, bloodshed, and systematic brutality than it has peace.
But hold on, doesn't the existence of God also prevent some atrocities? By providing a baseline moral code that, unites millions of people?
The source argues that this supposed moral code is completely undermined by the contradictory nature of the holy books themselves. They're full of conflicting messages.
Which allows leaders, religious or political, to just cherry-pick whatever scripture they need to justify the action they already wanted to take.
Precisely. The Torah prohibits killing, but it also authorizes the extermination of the 7 Canaanite peoples. The Gospels preach love thy neighbor, but Jesus drives the moneylenders from the temple with a whip.
And that contradiction, the passive turning of the other cheek right next to the violent expulsion from the temple, that's critical for understanding the selective application.
It is the justification grab bag. The source notes that even Hitler used that image of Jesus driving the moneylenders out to defend some of his early political measures against financial interests.
So scripture in this reading isn't a moral compass at all.
It's a versatile tool, where every fact articulated is almost immediately confronted with its opposite, making it infinitely adaptable to justify power.
Let's delve deeper into this historical analysis, particularly concerning Christianity and its highly controversial involvement in 20th century atrocities, as claimed in the source. This demands a really careful explanation of the source's reasoning.
It does. And the source makes a deeply troubling claim about the Catholic Church's collusion with Nazism. It argues it was driven by a shared, deep-seated loathing of Jews and communists.
The concept of Judeo-Bolshevism.
Exactly. And the source presents a timeline that's intended to be highly incriminating. It claims the church approved German rearmament, it signed the Concordat with Hitler in 1933, and then it remained silent on the Nuremberg Laws and on Kristallnacht.
That silence on state-sanctioned violence against Jews and dissidents is a very severe charge. What specific actions does the source point to regarding the genocide itself?
Well, the source claims the church provided genealogical records to the Nazis to help identify non-Jews for the administration of the Nuremberg Laws, while at the same time it used pastoral secrecy to avoid revealing the identities of Jewish converts who were hiding.
And most shockingly,
the church never publicly or privately condemned the genocide. The source asserts that this was due to an internal agreement on anti-Semitic principles, and it never excommunicated Hitler.
And then after the war, the Vatican, according to this source, set up a network to smuggle war criminals out of Europe.
Yes, a rat line it was called. Using Vatican visas and monasteries, it was established to aid figures like Adolf Eichmann and others escaped to South America.
And the source contrasts this act of assistance with the complete lack of any similar action for a single Jewish victim,
suggesting an active ideological alignment rather than just, simple political pragmatism.
This pattern of justifying systemic violence, though, isn't new. The source traces it all the way back to the legacy of Augustine.
Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo. He dedicated his formidable intellect to justifying the absolute worst aspects of the church. Slavery, capital punishment, war. He sanctioned something called just persecution.
Just persecution. That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
It is. He argued it was motivated by love, which is the ultimate perversion of ethics. And crucially, he formulated the concept of just war.
How did his idea of a just war legitimize imperial conquests?
By recycling the ancient pagan idea of trial by ordeal. He asserted that the victor in a war was designated by God. So if you won, God must have been on your side.
Which thereby legitimizes any massacre or conquest necessary to achieve that victory.
Exactly. And this legacy persisted for centuries. It was cited by French bishops and even John Paul II in the 20th century to defend the nuclear deterrent.
Arguing the atom bomb opened the road to peace.
It creates a theological moral vacuum. And this concept was then exported globally to justify colonialism and what the source calls ethnocide.
The Torah defends slavery, Genesis 9, and Augustine encouraged the slave to toil with a zeal that would be pleasing to God.
Right. The three monotheisms all justified enslaving enemies as a mark of infamy. But the unique Christian contribution specifically is noted as the invention of ethnocide, the spiritual extinction of cultures.
And this is referring to the destruction of Amerindian civilizations after 1492.
Precisely. The soldiers were followed by priests who preached brotherly love, while their civilization delivered syphilis and other diseases, systematically destroying native languages and spiritual practices, all in the name of salvation.
And this pattern continues into the modern era. The source highlights the Rwandan genocide,
where Catholic clergy were actively involved with Hutu exterminators, even purchasing machetes and enabling the destruction of churches where victims were hiding. It's a showcase of the lasting, horrific legacy of Augustine's just persecution.
Moving on to Islam, the source critiques it as adopting the worst legacies of both Judaism and Christianity.
A superiority complex and a death cult. That's the charge.
How so?
It synthesized the Jewish concept of the chosen people and the Christian zeal for conversion, but it rejected equality. It maintains a strict hierarchy where Muslims dominate the peoples of the book, Christians and Jews, who are, in turn, superior to all other unbelievers.
So the community, the Ummah, considers itself the chosen people.
Which makes it, the source argues, fundamentally incompatible with Enlightenment societies that are based on universal equality.
And this inherent superiority complex is then weaponized through the contradictory concept of jihad.
Right, despite that beautiful verse, whoever slays one soul, it is as though he slew all men. There are nearly 250 other verses that justify holy war, jihad.
The biography of the Prophet himself is full of it.
Constantly recurs with murder, crime, punitive expeditions. This ambiguity allows for the selective cherry-picking needed to justify aggression and intolerance.
And this theology, the source says, culminated in the 1978 Iranian Revolution, which it labels explicitly as authentic Muslim fascism, a society based on Sharia law.
And here the source issues a fascinating critique of Western intellectuals, like Michel Foucault,
who wrongly saw the revolution as the most modern form of revolt.
Exactly. Foucault, having studied confinement, madness, and prison, should have understood immediately that a government inspired by Sharia would enlist everything he'd ever fought against.
Sexual discrimination, the logic of confessions, the punitive society.
All of it. The Islamic government, applying Quranic principles, marked Islam's entry into postmodern politics. But what it ushered in was a green fascism, a static, closed, hierarchical, and deeply punitive system. It's the death fixation made political reality.
Wow. We have completed a massive deep dive, following a critical analysis that traces monotheism's history of hostility toward life, intelligence, and the body, all rooted in this fixation on death and the denial of reality.
I think the key takeaway is how this death fixation gets encoded into our foundational epistemology. It creates a default position in Western culture.
So even a self-proclaimed secular society is still operating under its vestiges.
Especially in law. Concepts we take for granted, like free will and responsibility, are fundamentally Judeo-Christian notions. You need them to justify guilt, sin, and punitive justice, regardless of what neuroscience might say about consciousness.
So the author calls for a new post-Christian secular order, and it's not just about negation, it's about construction.
Yes, this requires moving past just being an atheist and toward what the philosopher Gilles Deleuze called quiet atheism.
Quiet atheism, what does that mean?
It's not a loud polemic against belief. It's a dynamic method for post-conflict reconstruction. It moves past the simple denial of God and focuses on building a new secular ethic, one based on joy, health, and reality.
And this construction is based on an ethical concept proposed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
The hedonist contract, which is a utilitarian, pragmatic view. Good and evil only matter as factors to ensure the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. There's no need for transcendent obligations, no threats of hell, no promises of paradise to get people to act in a just and honest way.
Morality becomes a pragmatic calculation, no divine mandate.
Exactly.
And the ultimate task, drawing on Nietzsche's concept of transvaluation, is to move past the denial of God and establish an ethic where the body is not a punishment, the earth is no longer a vale of tears, and this life, this one right here, is the only one that matters.
To leave you with a final provocative thought, based on all this systematic deconstruction, We've seen how concepts of guilt and sin and punitive justice are all tied to original sin and to Paul's personal neurosis. So what old assumption about reality or morality, one that's widely accepted in today's secular world, might secretly stem from this Judeo-Christian epistemology, even when there's no priest in the room?
That's a great question. Maybe. Maybe the deeply ingrained societal reflex that suffering is salutary. The idea that pain and suffering build character, that we have to endure hardship to be worthy, or that self-denial is intrinsically virtuous.
The no pain, no gain ethos applied to morality.
Exactly. If virtue doesn't require asceticism or masochistic self-flagellation like Paul preached, then the celebration of joy, of pleasure, of bodily health, that becomes the highest moral good. That is a transvaluation that is still facing immense historical inertia.
It's a very difficult assumption to shake, but a necessary one if we are truly to move into a post-Christian secular order. Something to think about long after this dive ends.
We've reached the bottom, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Until then.